Shaul takes a team or pair of oxen, slaughters them, and dissects them into parts before the messengers, and sends them to all the tribes of Israel with a message. Whoever comes not forth after Shaul and after Shmuel, so shall be done unto his oxen. And the verse relates that the dread of the Almighty fell on the people, and they came out as one man together to war. But make no mistake, Shaul's warning to them was not a simple threat. Rather, the entire Jewish people understood at that time that if they did not stand together, they would fall. Episode 1, The Rise of King Saul. The year is 2884 by the ancient Hebrew calendar, the year 877 BCE, fully 436 years after the great exodus from Egypt, and a full 396 years after Joshua, the son of Nun, led the children of Israel back into their ancestral land, the land of Israel. This was then, and continues to be today, the very center of the spiritual universe, the land promised by the Almighty to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are currently in the middle of the land, between the Great Sea, what we call today the Mediterranean Sea, on the western side, and the Dead Sea on the eastern side. We are high in the mountains of Ephraim, in the area of the town of Ramatayim Tzofim, in English, the Lookout Heights, to the northwest of the Dead Sea, on the border of the tribes of Binyamin and Ephraim. After 4 centuries of intermittent peace and battle, the children of Israel by this time have divided the land into their 12 tribes, each one nestled into the mountains and valleys of their ancient heritage. This is not a historical accident or footnote of history. As the book of Genesis relates, this land was promised by the Creator of the world to the Avos, to the forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But the divine promise comes with the covenant. Keep the divine commandments, cleave close to the Holy Torah, and all will be peaceful and well. But stray from that path, and the book of Deuteronomy promises that there will be need for battle. Commanded by the Almighty to take the land that is their divine heritage, the children of Israel have battled the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, and the Amorites. These nations forfeited their own rights to dwell in this holy place by their idol worship and black magic, as well as their cruel and deviant practices. Meanwhile, the Girgashites, the 7th nation that occupied the land at that time, have heard about the utter obliteration of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan, at their borders. Preferring discretion as the better part of valor, the Girgashites chose to simply pick up their skirts and flee without waiting for battle. There, like the other 6 nations would, the Girgashites disappear into the mists of historical oblivion, never to be seen again. The same will happen within a short time with the remnants of the other 6 nations. Where are they today? The Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, and the Amorites. Only memorialized on Torah scrolls and the archaeological artifacts on display at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, the museum of the dead cultures who have attempted to destroy the children of Israel. Yet while there were periods during which the land was peaceful and quiet, those were periods when the children of Israel had not strayed from their covenant with the Almighty. During those periods, they fulfilled the duties and responsibilities of their covenant. Now, however, in the wake of experiments by a small minority of ignorant members of the nation who have become too curious about the ways of the former people of the land and have experimented, they too, against the Almighty's command, have begun to dabble in idol worship. Even though these misguided individuals are a small minority, the good land is no longer peaceful. To the west, in the area now called the Gaza Strip, the Plishtim, a seafaring people, in English the Philistines, who are related to the Carthaginians, and perhaps to the Greeks as well, who were idol worshippers of the god Dagon, the big fish, and a pantheon of other gods, including blood cults demanding human sacrifice of newborn babies, are encroaching upon the children of Israel. Meanwhile, the hate-filled Amalekites, under their implacable king Agag, engage in bloody skirmishes with the Jews from the desert, and in the northeast, Nachash, the Ammonite, lays siege to the walled town of Yavesh Gilead. There is also unrest within the people of Israel themselves. All is not going as well as it had in the days of Yehoshua. The sons of the prophet Shmuel, the man who led and judged Israel for 40 years, are not living up to the standard of their righteous father, while Shmuel, in English Samuel, traveled from place to place. His sons stay far from most of the children of Israel in the far southern town of Beersheba. Now comes the moment of truth. After 40 years spent in the wilderness and 436 years in the land of Israel, the elders of the community, the judges who govern the affairs of the children of Israel, the Sanhedrin, have made a startling and sudden request of Shmuel, who is by now in virtual retirement. Vayhi kasher zaken Shmuel, v'yasem es banav, shoftim. And so it was when Shmuel grew old, and he placed his sons as judges, begins the verse. All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Shmuel at Ramah. Vayomru elav, hine ata zakanta, uvanecha lo halchu bedrachecha, ata sima lanu melech l'shaftenu kikol hagoyim. And they said to him, You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore, appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations. Shmuel tells them, Now therefore, stand still, that I may set before you all the righteous acts of the Almighty, which he did to you and your forefathers. When Yaakov, was come into Egypt, then your fathers cried out to the Almighty, and the Almighty sent Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, and Aaron, HaKohen, who brought forth your fathers out of Egypt, and they were made to dwell in this place. But they forgot the Almighty, their divine source, and the Almighty gave them over into the hands of Sisera, captain of the coast of Chatzor, and into the hands of the Plishtim, and into the hands of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried unto the Almighty and said, We have sinned, because we have forsaken the Almighty, and have served the Baalim and the Ashtaroth. But now deliver us out of the hand of our enemies, and we will serve you. And so the Almighty sent Jerubbaal and Bedan, who was Shimshon Hagibor, and Yiftach and Shmuel, and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you dwelt in safety. Shmuel goes on, Be careful to fear the Almighty and serve him and heed his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Almighty. And both you and also the king that reigns over you will be followers of the Almighty, your divine source. But if you will fail to heed the voice of the Almighty and rebel against the commandment of the Almighty, then shall the hand of the Almighty be hard against you and against your fathers. So now the people of Israel have asked Shmuel to appoint a king. The account in the book of Deuteronomy, Dvarim, states, If, after you have entered the land that the Almighty has given you, and taken possession of it, and settled within it, you resolve, I will set a king to rule over me, as do all the surrounding nations, you indeed surely shall set a king to rule over you, one chosen by the Almighty, your divine source. From your own brothers you shall appoint a king. You shall not set a stranger over you, one who is not of your brothers. Thus, it would seem that it is an actual commandment by the Almighty himself to appoint a king. But Shmuel tells us at this juncture, in the name of the Almighty himself, that their request to appoint a king in Shmuel's time is actually evil in the sight of their leader, the prophet Shmuel, and by extension in the sight of the Almighty himself. Why, then? Why should the request to appoint a king over Israel be negative, if it is in fact a Torah commandment? This question is further strengthened by the source of the people's request. The request comes not from just anyone, but from the Skenim. These are the elders of the people, the Sanhedrin, worthy sages. True, Shmuel is the head of them all, a prophet to whom the Almighty speaks directly, whose mother Hannah was barren, and who was granted a child by divine intercession as a result of her prayer, who, it is said, is the continuation of Moshe himself, the prophet who led the Jewish people out of Egyptian slavery. Why then should the people of Israel wish for any other than Shmuel himself? But there is always a tension between living with great faith in the divine, whose will is expressed by the prophets and the judges and sages or wise men of Israel, and living a this-worldly life like others do. Indeed, that tension remains a powerful dynamic all the way until the present day. So Shmuel admonishes the children of Israel, saying, to paraphrase, "You are rebelling against the Almighty and against me. Who was it who delivered your forefathers from Egypt? Who was it who delivered you from the Moabites and from all of your enemies over history? And as for me, have I ever taken so much as a donkey from you? Have I ever enriched myself or sought my own selfish interest? Has there ever been a conflict of interest? But it is not against me that you are rebelling, but rather against the Almighty himself." Nonetheless, Shmuel heeds the word of the Almighty, for such is his mandate as a prophet, and he resolves to fulfill their request, and he sends them home. In typical prophecy form, Shmuel is given a very clear prediction by the Almighty of when the new king will appear before him. Tomorrow, at a certain time, the new king will appear. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the land of Israel, Shaul, the son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin, is wandering around the country with a young servant looking for his father's livestock, a herd of she-donkeys, of which Shaul was in charge. Their money is running out, and they are going from place to place, trying to find the lost animals, for Shaul fears losing favor in his father's sight as a result of losing track of the animals in his charge. Shaul's young servant makes a suggestion as they reach the area in which Shmuel lives. "There is a man of God here," he tells Shaul, "a prophet. Let's go up to him and ask him to tell us where to find our she-donkeys." They agree to send the young servant so as to avoid having to pay for the information, because they've run out of both money and food. They ask directions, and Shmuel's location is pointed out to them. But as they ascend to the town, it turns out they don't need to go to Shmuel, for Shmuel himself comes out to greet them. This is the appointed time that Shmuel was told of by the Almighty. Shmuel greets Shaul and tells him his father's she-donkeys have already been found, and Shaul need not worry. But he also tells Shaul that he need not worry about the donkeys anymore for another reason. Because from now on, Shaul is beyond that. He will be the leader of Israel and will have more weighty matters to consider. Shmuel takes Shaul into his home and privately communicates deep secrets of Torah to him. Then, before taking leave of him, he pours a vial of anointing oil upon his head, not yet the holy anointing oil, fine pressed olive oil, by which he will be made king, but only with persimmon oil, as befits a lesser prince of Israel. And he kisses him and says to him, "Has not the Almighty anointed you to be a prince over his inheritance, the children of Israel?" Before sending Shaul and his young servant home again, he tells Shaul that he will meet 3 sets of people on his way home. The first set of people whom Shaul will meet at Rachel's tomb are those who are unconcerned with divine matters. They will reveal to him the location of his she-donkeys. The second is a pair on their way to the temple in Jerusalem to bring sacrifices, and the third pair he will meet will be from the priestly class, Kohanim. This indeed occurs, and it represents, say the ancient sources, three disparate groups in the Jewish people, indeed, to the present day. The first group he meets represents the so-called Bnei Bilial, those who are Bli'ol, who are unconcerned with Torah and mitzvahs, the divine commandments. These want no king chosen by the prophet Shmuel, but rather a king like those of the surrounding nations, who is concerned simply with making war on their behalf, and unconcerned with, in their eyes, primitive, quote-unquote, matters of the divine. This group, when Shaul meets them, tell him about the whereabouts of his father's she-donkeys, because the word for donkey in Hebrew, chamor, also denotes physicality. So too, this group are concerned primarily with worldly pleasures and worldly matters, physicality. Hence, it is appropriate for them to provide the news of the finding of the she-donkeys, who themselves represent that physicality. The second group Shaul meets, and which he indeed encounters per Shmuel's prophecy, are on their way to bring korbanos, offerings, in the holy temple in Jerusalem. This group represents the simple but genuinely devoted people who serve the Almighty through works, but without deep understanding of the Holy Torah. These good people happily give Shaul bread, representing the fruits of divine service. Finally, Shmuel prophesies that Shaul is to meet that third group, this one made up of the Kohanim, or men from the priestly line, originating with Aaron, the first Kohen designated by the Almighty to serve the Jewish people. This group Shaul meets as well, and they bring him up to them to discuss deep matters of divine knowledge and confer upon him the gift of prophecy. This group represents those individuals closest to the Almighty, because they are the ones who busy themselves with deeply understanding the divine will as reflected in the Holy Torah. Yet Shaul is not active in his kingship, and he simply returns to his father's house, where he busies himself with agricultural matters, at least for the moment. The scene of the ancient account here leaves Shaul in his father's house and sweeps approximately 100 miles away into the town of Yavesh Gilead, which today lies across the Jordan River in the modern country of Jordan. Here in Yavesh Gilead, the tribe of Benjamin, took wives after the civil war of attrition against them that followed the shocking affair of the Pelagish of Geva, the concubine of Geva, in which the remainder of the tribes of Israel took vengeance on the tribe of Benjamin, all of which events precede the time frame of our story and are beyond the scope of this podcast. The town of Yavesh has been placed under siege by the king of Ammon named Nachash, whose name means snake or serpent. The inhabitants, the remaining Benjaminites who survived the civil war with the other tribes, are in no position to resist Nachash's much greater and more powerful force. They sue for peace, offering to enter into a covenant of peace with Nachash the Ammonite and serve his kingdom. But the reply they receive shocks them. A covenant of peace, says Nachash, involves exchanging things of value between two parties who are on equal footing. But you, misbegotten residents of Yavesh, scoffs Nachash, have nothing to offer me. I can simply crush you. This, then, is my proposal, my offer to you. I will gouge out the right eye of every male among you, and this shall be symbolic of the humiliation that I shall visit upon your entire Israelite people. Then, that being done, I will give you your covenant of peace. Understandably, the people of Yavesh reacted in horror to this cruel proposal. But then, the elders of the town, ever people of wisdom, send back the following message to the Ammonite king. This gouging out of eyes is only valuable to you as a symbolic victory if the other tribes of Israel hear and know about it. Allow us a week so that we may send word of the covenant of peace you offer to them, so that the thing may be known to them." To this Nachash agreed, and word was sent by the elders of Yavesh to all the tribes of Israel. When the Jewish people heard of the terrible threat hanging over the heads of the Benjaminites in Yavesh at the hands of the Ammonites, they wept bitterly. Word reaches Shaul as well in his father's land at the edge of the tribe of Benjamin, in Jerusalem, where their land bordered that of the tribe of Judah, Yehudah. Then, on receiving the news, a divine spirit of strength descends upon Shaul, and he gathers messengers to send to the entire Jewish people. Shaul takes a team or pair of oxen, slaughters them, and dissects them into parts before the messengers, and sends them to all the tribes of Israel with a message. "Whoever comes not forth after Shaul and after Shmuel, so shall be done unto his oxen." And the verse relates that the dread of the Almighty fell on the people, and they came out as one man together to war. But make no mistake, Shaul's warning to them was not a simple threat. Rather, the entire Jewish people understood at that time that if they did not stand together, they would fall, each part separately, that their strength was only in unity. This they understood, and that is why they all turned out together to face this implacable foe, Nachash, the king of Ammon. And Shaul numbered the men who turned out for war in Bezek, and there were 300,000 from 11 tribes, and 30,000 from the tribe of Judah. And Shaul sent a message to the people of the town of Yavesh, saying, "So shall you say to them, tomorrow by the time the heat of the day arrives, you shall have salvation." To which the beleaguered men of Yavesh were glad, and they sent word back that they would come out to Shaul the very next day, and he should do with them as he saw fit. No sooner did the pillar of dawn break the next day than the assembled men of the tribes of Israel, whom Shaul had divided into 3 divisions, descended on the encamped Ammonites who were besieging Yavesh, and they smote them, so that those who were not killed immediately fled singly. Not even 2 Ammonites remained together, so great was their fear. The people of Israel rejoiced and recognized Shaul as their king, and they called for anyone who had questioned his kingship to be put to death as rebels against the king. To this Shaul replied, "No one will be put to death today, for this is a day of salvation, on which the Almighty has delivered us from our enemies." There had been no rebellion against the king, in his view, because the king had not yet been officially recognized and anointed before the Jewish people. Then the prophet Shmuel calls for the Jewish people to anoint Shaul in Gilgal, and they assemble, and he calls for them to bring in korbanos, animal offerings, zvachim, to the Almighty in honor of the coronation of the king. But instead of a celebration, Shmuel reiterates in a long speech of admonition that the Jewish people have sinned in seeking a king to replace the Almighty, and Shmuel as the Almighty's prophet and judge. Shmuel goes through the history since the exodus from Egypt. He shows them that without a king, the Almighty himself both punished them when they strayed from the way of the mitzvahs and saved them from their enemies when they repented from their erring ways. Shmuel shows them Shaul. But once again, he calls them sinners for failing to believe in the Almighty and trust in him. Then he calls them to observe a great sign from the Almighty, telling them that they will now see violent thunder and rain on the fields of wheat before them. And after praying to the Almighty, this indeed occurs. The lesson in this is that in fact nothing at all has changed. The Almighty is still in charge and acts through his prophets, as he does through Shmuel himself. The thunder and rain can be positive. If they are given as bracha, as blessing, they allow the crops to grow and flourish. But if given in zam, in kas, divine wrath, the Almighty can use them as agents of destruction. The covenantal relationship means that the choice is in fact our own. The people are chagrined. They beg Shmuel, "Pray for us to the Almighty, your divine source, so that we not die. For we have added to all our sins this additional evil, to ask in this way for a king for ourselves." Yet Shmuel now comforts them. "Fear not, you have indeed done all this evil, but turn not aside from following the Almighty, but serve the Almighty with all your heart, and turn you not aside, for then should you go after futile things which cannot help you or save you, for they are futile things. For the Almighty will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Almighty to make you a people unto himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Almighty in ceasing to pray for you, but I will instruct you in the good and the right way. Only fear the Almighty and be in awe of him, and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." In this statement, Shmuel sets a model for all of the prophets. Unlike the anti-Semites, who are quick to condemn and excoriate the Jewish people, Shmuel's intentions are only constructive. He seeks not only to call out improper behavior on the part of the Jewish people, but also to console them. If you do the right thing, if you return to the Almighty will always save you. So there is no need to be afraid. And he calls the idea of his not praying for the people itself a sin. Like a loving father, the Almighty is not seeking to cruelly punish his people, but rather to guide them on the right path. And like a loving father, he will always continue to love them and take them back when they mend their ways. And the Almighty expects the same attitude from his prophets, as Shmuel himself points out. So the covenant between the Almighty and the Jewish people ever was and ever will be. It would seem then that the basic dynamic between the Jewish people and the Almighty has not really changed in its fundamentals, in the covenantal relationship. The Jewish people, before being ruled by a king as afterwards, are charged with awe of the Almighty as well as fulfilling his mitzvahs. If they do so, the king and his people will prosper, and the Almighty will show favor in all their endeavors. If not, if they do transgress, the king will not save them from divine punishment, and they will go through the same dynamic of the covenant, of straying from the divine path, causing trials and tribulations, and then returning to the divine path and reaping the benefits and blessings of the Master of the world. A king is just an additional factor and intermediary in the Jewish people's eternal covenantal relationship with the Creator of the universe. Yet there is a deep tension in what has occurred. Shaul, the first king of Israel, is from the tribe of Benjamin. He is not from the tribe of Yehudah. This is because the Almighty was displeased with the request of the people to appoint a king. And so this first king, Shaul, who was chosen, would be one who would not have divine protection for the generations. Because from the beginning, the Almighty has promised through Jacob, whom the Almighty named Israel, quote, "The scepter shall not depart from the tribe of Yehudah, nor the ruler's staff from beneath his feet." This Benjaminite, Shaul, would not fulfill this eternal prophecy. And so all of the subsequent events can be seen in the light of the divine will to ensure that no other tribe of Israel would hold the kingship other than Yehudah. It is axiomatic that the divine force that governs the world does so with its own ultimate goals in mind, and many of the events that subsequently come to pass are indeed in fulfillment of those goals. All of what has been said until now about the prophet Shmuel and the rise of King Shaul has been according to the plain meaning of the story, what the sages call the pshat. However, buried deep under the plain meaning are deeper layers of meaning. To get a taste of the honey under the tongue of these verses, we bring the understanding of Rabbi David Kimchi of Occitane in Provence, known as the Radak, among other things a student of Maimonides, who explains that Nachash's demand for the right eye of the people of Yavesh actually refers to a demand to teach him Torah, which was a direct contravention of the commandment not to allow Ammonites into the congregation of the Almighty due to their bad acts and evil character. And Shmuel's decision to anoint Shaul at Gilad as king was due to the fact that it was among the first places in Israel, in the Holy Land, that had been conquered by Joshua, and also an early resting place in the Holy Land of the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron, as if to say, this king is going in the way of Joshua and of the Ark of the Covenant. So indeed it was, for the sages say that Shaul is a thoroughly righteous man, and did not in fact transgress. In their words, he never tasted the taste of sin. That is so despite the fraught events later in the history of this great king. But that is a subject of future episodes of the Kings of Israel. In the next episode of the Kings of Israel, we will watch Shaul begin to consolidate his kingship. But he will not have been king long before a war of total annihilation falls upon him and his young kingdom. There is great trouble brewing, both from external enemies and from internal strife. Externally, from the neighboring Plishtim, the Philistines, and internally, between King Shaul and one of his own sons.